Today, we're launching the Democracy Resource Hub. This is a fairly big piece of work that we've been working on for a little while. And it's really great to see so many people here to join us for this. We're really looking forward to seeing what people think about the work that we've been undertaking for this little while. In the session today, we're going to have a look at why we've built the Democracy Resource Hub. We're going to take a little bit of a deep dive into the approach. Why are we a network, and how does the Democracy Resource Hub and the work that is included in this, how is that part of the way that the Democracy Network operates, and why is that important? Then we're going to jump into a live demo of the overview of the Resource Hub. Hopefully everything works. And then we're going to talk a little bit about leveraging the resources in the hub through your work, before finishing off with a little bit of what comes next, followed by a little bit of time for Q&A. Please do pop any questions you have in the Zoom chat, and we'll come back to a wide discussion after we've run through some of these slides on the hub. So, why would the Democracy Network build a resource hub? The short reason is to provide organizations, projects, and individuals in the democracy sector with the resources they need to get on with and thrive in their work. But it's a little bit more than that, and we're going to go into some of the reasons for that now. Democracy Network calls itself a network for a reason. Our work is based on a theory of change, based on an established network development practice. At its core, a change-generating network's impact will be determined by the strength and proliferation of relationships between its constituent members or its ecosystem. So what we mean by this is that we work to create and develop opportunities and spaces for individuals to reach out across divides, collaborate, share information, and fundamentally build trust in each other, empathy with each other's viewpoints and perspectives, and a familiarity with the topics and touch points of other organizations within the democracy sector that they might be working around. As catalysts of this network, our team and some of those conveners in the sector, we can foster this connectedness in practical and concrete ways through programs of intentional matchmaking and network weaving, creating direct one-to-one connections between peers, as many of you might have experienced through some of the work that we've been doing, and performing a signposting role, facilitating learning circles and convening spaces, problem solving in peer-to-peer groups, and some of the various things that we've been doing through the work of Democracy Network for the past couple of years. In addition to creating spaces for connection, such as democracy drinks, the co-working, the lunchtime webinars, the campaign, how to win workshops, and so on. But the role of network catalysts, such as myself and the rest of our staff team, such as Adam and Jesse here, and many of yourselves within your own communities or clusters, as we talk about them through the work of the network, amongst such a sizable sector of 700 or more organizations that we've mapped across the sector, and the thousands of amazing community-based organizations too, can only be so great. We can only have so many one-to-one meetings and run so many events. At some point, we have to consider the question of connectivity, or the general amount and quality of connectedness in a system, and what we can do to maximize our impact at that sort of scale. So to use a common network analogy of the soil food web, if intentional matchmaking between organizations, so the one-to-ones, is akin to watering a pair of plants in a forest, then enhancing connectivity across an entire sector is working out how to feed the mycelial or sort of mushroom networks from which our shared endeavors grow and thrive. And that's where we come to the term network infrastructure. Some of you might have been to some of the various events that we run, or have looked at some of the various blogs that we've written, or just talked to some members of our team, and you might have come across this word. So coming back to the analogy, we can provide some of the much needed nutrients for those mycelial mushroom networks through a form of network mulch or network infrastructure. By this, we mean providing a sort of foundational resource and information layer needed for people and organizations in the UK democracy space to both thrive and for networking efforts to be able to build from. Think of it as a sort of bottom base of a pyramid upon which the rest of the network efforts sit. And over the next few months, through the Resource Hub, we'll form the base of that pyramid together. So what's in this mulch or network infrastructure, and what do we actually mean by this? Many of you will already be familiar with many aspects of this, so I'll just run through some of them. The UK Democracy Map, we'll go into this in a bit more detail as well in the live demo in a moment. The UK Democracy Map, the directory of more than 800 organisations comprising the UK democracy sector. The UK Democracy Bulletin, a monthly newsletter generated through reading every newsletter published by organisations across the sector every month, as well as lurking on Slacks, WhatsApp and other social media. The Democracy Funding List, so that a list of most of the organisations funding democracy organisations in the UK, more on that in a moment. And the Democracy Jobs Board. Just let Helen in there. As well as other aspects, such as the UK Democracy Calendar, this large sectoral calendar of events from across the democracy sector that we'll be bringing back next month, and the UK Democracy Check-in, which I know that many of you have been to, the monthly sharing space to highlight what you're working on and seeking assistance and offering help and all that sort of stuff. You could probably add some of our work and offers and needs to this list too. So this is what we mean by the information layer. We believe that through this evergreen work and our other efforts, people in the democracy sector are more likely to collaborate and work together and talk to each other more, which is the crux of what we're really trying to achieve here. Because through talking to each other and collaborating more, we develop more impact, build a stronger democracy. Through listing what everyone is doing through the bulletin, for example, people are more likely to get a greater sense of what is happening and what is possible, and importantly, jump on opportunities when they present themselves. So we've seen this time and time again. For example, we know that the Democracy Defence Coalition, the convening work back in 2021 in response to the elections bill, the work there was sped up significantly because the various stakeholders, Fair Vote UK, Unlock Democracy, ERS, etc., that work sped up because someone, I think it was Carl Taylor, read that someone was thinking about it in the bulletin. I think it was Carl that was thinking about it in the bulletin, actually, and the others sort of clocked that and then messaged him about it at the time. There's a direct impact there in a way that some of that information is, it's like a newsletter. Similarly, through sharing jobs and funding opportunities, we are more likely to develop a culture of building talent within the sector or of working together on bids. Through sharing a full directory of organisations and projects working on democracy, power and voice in the UK, we are making the invisible visible and providing that crucial context, which is why we've called it a map. But these resources also provide another important function for networks and for our work. They begin the process of removing myself and the wider Democracy Network team, and perhaps other conveners in the sector too, as information bottlenecks, allowing you to get on with what you need to do instead of waiting to have a chat with us. So why networks? Networks also allow for knowledge exchange amongst groups that might otherwise not communicate directly. More dense networks allow for sharing information rapidly and effectively. They allow for the spread of ideas and best practice. They can, and we aim for in our work, to engender a culture of openness and generosity across the sector. If the requisite trust, familiarity, and empathy exist across a network, deeper levels of collaboration can take place, pooling resources and expertise of the network to achieve more together than they would working in isolation, like the Democracy Defence Coalition, like the network itself. This might include joint funding bids, campaigns, shared office space, shared operations functions, or press lists. Some of this is actively being talked about at the moment. The list goes on, and the ambition is palpable. So to summarize all of this with one of my favorite quotes by Jennifer Bailey, relationships move at the speed of trust and social change moves at the speed of relationships. And this is all about creating the foundation layer for the relationship work. Anyway, importantly, back to the Resource Hub. For those who've been following the development of the network and the various predecessor projects, you'll notice that we've been doing most of this for a very long time already. Democracy Resource Hub is in many ways largely a major upgrade to the ways in which we communicate these efforts and this information, making it more accessible to you. And before we jump into the live demo, and the walkthrough of the Resource Hub, I'd just like to mention and thank the various individuals and organizations that have supported and developed this work over the years, including Corio, the Centre for Democracy, Newspeak House, the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, and Nesta's Democracy Pioneers Fund, as well as many, many others who are also on this call, who have supported their work and the work of the Democracy Network in recent years, as well as the wider community and Democracy Network membership here in the democracy sector. So, live demo time. If you've got any questions, please do pop them in the chat and we'll get to them really shortly. Jumped the gun a bit there. So, just to assuming everyone can still see my screen, this is the Democracy Resource Hub. We're going to post a link in the chat very shortly. As you can see here, this is a homepage. There are 4 key aspects here: the UK Democracy Map, this full list of democracy organisations and projects I described a second ago, democracy jobs, a full database of every job listing across the democracy sector at any given time, and the democracy funding portal, which is a full database of funders that we've worked with the Civic Power Fund, and training webinars and guides, which is very much like internal Democracy Network resources. So we're just going to jump straight into the biggest of these, the UK Democracy Map. So the UK Democracy Map is an open database of 800 organisations, projects and campaigns. Many of you might have seen a previous version of this, which was largely based on Airtable. This is a new version, a new accessible version. So you can type anything in here. So we can type disability, for example, and it should show up organizations like Disabilities Policy Centre, My Vote, My Voice. So this resource here, which has over 800 organizations in it, including the Democracy Archive being those organizations that are effectively no longer with us for any reason, because they've lost funding or because they have completed their work, perhaps. One sec. So in this, we have more than 800 organizations, as I've said, and we've split these into, I believe, 31 different, there's a taxonomy sheet that I can show you as well. We've split this into 31 different categories or topics, as we've called them, from accountability and transparency to civic education to underrepresented groups and people working on these different aspects. And the project types, so academic organizations, alliances and coalitions, campaign organizations, charitable funders, and so on and so on, as well as where are they in the UK or internationally. So like most of the work of the UK Democracy Network, our primary focus, our laser focus, is on the UK itself. But some of those organizations have an overlap with the wider work or are just really important, like organizations like VDEM, the academic group, who sort of create that sort of fantastic report every year on the health of democracy. So some of those are in there because we think they're really important. But largely it's these groups here. So we can also jump straight down into Democracy Drinks, for example, and we can see here that this is an organization, and we've split this into what the type of organization. It's an event, because this is a monthly event that we run, or other organizations also run across the European Union. What's the work focus of the organizations? Community power. What's the geography? It's global. I should say also UK there. And then we've also got various bits here, the communication aspects and description. And importantly, so you can click here, so you can click learn more, and it will jump off to the website of the organization. But you can also add more information to the entry. So you can, I'm just going to full screen because it's difficult. So on any given democracy map details page, which is what we call these, by clicking add more information to this entry, you can review you can add more information to this entry. So you'd say like democracy drinks. So you'll add like democracy drinks to the what's the name of the organization. And this will put all of this information to our Airtable on the back. And we'll review this on sort of on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. And we'll make all these updates as and when. In addition to that, you can also add new organizations if you think they're missing, but please do search for them first. There's not too many duplicates. And we have a handy FAQ right at the bottom here as well, which goes into some details about how you can interact with the database. There are, like I said, there are an inordinate number of organizations in this list, and I really do recommend going through it. Most of them have logos as well. If any of this information is incorrect, please do let us know, but we think this is a really powerful resource for organizations. As I alluded to in that presentation, just using this, so let's focus on, say, civic education. So just using this should give you an appreciation for a particular part of the sector. So the way in which we understand the democracy map this work was largely based off a piece of work by Corio and Johnny Will Chambers at that organization in around 2020. And myself through the Centre for Democracy and now the Democracy Network. Over these years, we've been improving this, which started off with around 400 organizations at the time that Johnny laid the foundations for this piece of work to now around 800. Johnny also laid the foundations in a number of different ways. He produced I'm assuming you can see this, he produced a taxonomy in his Mapping the Democracy Movement report, which is included here. There's around 44 different topic areas. And this is that we can talk about, we can also talk about in the discussion around the ways in which we have developed both this taxonomy, and Johnny has developed this taxonomy. I can send you some of those links to that report. But the way this basically is a way of categorizing all of the various organizations in the sector. Though there's also a difference between the way that Corio undertook that work and a slightly narrower focus on what we term, or what he termed, the democratic core organizations in the sector, which we think are around so it's a changing number, around 200 organizations in the sector. So those democratic core, those organizations that work on democracy or think about democracy or elections and everything else, or reform and transparency on a daily basis. Outside of that, you have wider interest organizations and rights, voice and policy. And the really key difference here is that whilst that report that Johnny produced several years ago very much focused on that democratic core and the taxonomy around those, we try to expand to include both some of the wider interest aspects and the rights, voice and policy. We can talk about this in more detail, and I highly recommend reading his report. This is we've basically translated the various aspects that he went into, or rather they and Corio went into detail on, and we've created this final list of topics here, which we're interested in having a wider discussion on, and wider work as well, wider investigation into whether those are the correct taxonomy. So back to the democracy map, as you can see, so that work is based on this. What else to talk about? Yeah, well, it's a really, really interesting piece of work. I've certainly enjoyed collating this over the past 4 years. And of course, I should probably mention the work of Max Roche as well, who is one of our associates here at the Democracy Network, who's also helped us to develop this mega list of 100 organizations. I'm going to go back now to... So just another example, just quickly. So we've got Democracy Box with Yvonne Murphy, I think, and their project. You can see here type, campaign, work focus, young people, civic education, geography UK, and a bit of information. And they're publicly available. These are all publicly available emails. We've double checked that there is no personal emails in this database. And you can see all of that information here. So we think this is a really useful resource, and I really look forward to hearing what you think about it. So we're going to jump back now to the democracy jobs. And then we'll talk a bit more about how this was produced as a whole over the years as well, in a sec. So democracy jobs page. It's pretty much what it says on the tin. It's inspired by, it's a sort of copy of, but a prettier version of, if anybody's familiar with the Electronic Campaign Forum and their jobs page, they produce a sort of weekly newsletter with job listings, which is very much what we're looking to do, and creating a home for all of those democracy jobs and democracy talent opportunities in the sector. So here we've got an array of different jobs across the sector, split down into, this is all based on the Airtable, which we populate on a weekly basis. This is the Airtable database on the back end. So we've got, the name of the opportunity, the organization, the GRT movement, how much the salary, and the deadline of this sort of different information here. And we hope that other organizations that we're going to add their roles into here. So this becomes very much a sort of a space for democracy organizations to share their talent and source talent from within the sector too, which I think is a really good idea. You can also subscribe to Democracy Bulletin to receive the full list of upcoming jobs every month, which is essentially this whole list. Again, you can also add a role here. If you have any queries about how this works or any of the other information in this form, please do get in touch. We've also added a few, I suppose you could call them wildcards to the form. So the sort of almost research aspect, because we're aware that, hundreds of organizations over the course of, so as I've mentioned before, it's not that these resources didn't necessarily exist, it's that they haven't existed in the way that they exist now. So previously they were quite inaccessible. It was basically a big database. And hundreds of organizations have used these over the years. And we're aware that this is the case. There's a level of scale to this, and there's an opportunity there as well. So there's an opportunity to find out, for example, how is this job funded? Obviously, this is optional. You don't have to share that sort of information. But this, imagine if everybody provided that information, and we'd be able to build that sort of we'd be able to build the story of how organizations are, we'll be able to tell that story together about how organizations are developing their projects and developing their work and their relationship with funders, and this broader picture, which is really, really interesting. We can also infer quite a lot in terms of data around salaries within the sector. If we have longitudinal data, which we do have, barring the past year for some reason, we have really good data on 2020 and 2021, most of 2022, and hopefully from this point onwards. And we have some really good data on salaries in those years, and how much they're changing, all this sort of stuff across the sector. Additionally, for all of these different aspects, there's a really interesting sort of data layer aspect for evaluation of the sector. So just jumping back again, I'm really looking forward to any questions you might have. I'm probably skipping over a few things here. So we're going to jump now to the funding section rather. So this is a list of what we think is most of the funders in the sector. We've had a lot of help from the Civic Power Fund, from Mohammed Afridi and Martha, at the team there, who've helped us collate this. So you can see here various organizations again. So within our database, this is essentially a slice of the democracy map, but this is funders only. So we'll just jump back a second. So you can see here the areas of focus. I would really appreciate some feedback on this, because large parts of this are assumed. We've been able to reach out to a certain subset of funders. So some of them we have concrete information on, some of it is basically assumed from, the team has basically gone on all of the websites, spent about 10 minutes trying to work out what they fund, and add it to this and the database that supports all of this work. So if you want to find like electoral organizations that fund electoral reform work, for example, or education, human rights, etc., you can have a look on there. If there's any changes you think we should make, again, as always with this, you can either contribute an organization here or edit the information because you think that, say, AB Charitable Trust, for example, does, I mean, I know they probably don't, but does add sort of does focus on like climate or the environment or something like that. So there's some really interesting information in this sheet, which is both a mix of publicly available information and also inference based on Civic Power Fund and the Democracy Network team, and their, I guess, somewhat our experience of working with various organizations. But there's a collective intelligence aspect here. Obviously, we want this to be the truth. There's a collective intelligence aspect here of like if the more people that contribute to these tools and these resources, like the Democracy Bulletin, like the map, like Democracy Check-ins, like all these different aspects, you know, like I was talking about earlier in the presentation, the more information we have, the better picture that we have together as a sector, and that information layer is just that piece stronger. So you can see here some really interesting information about smallest grants. So if you're looking for a grant that's smaller than that, you know, or you don't think you meet the turnover restrictions or bank account restrictions, you can find something else. And this, you know, this data does exist in other places. We based some of this research on particularly around what is funded to certain levels, like the band of minimum grant, largest grant. A lot of that is based on some research that we did through what's it called, 360 Giving's Grant Nav, which is really useful. But I mean that database is exceptionally useful. It's really detailed. But what we've tried to do here is try to make that just a little bit more accessible and directly relevant for democracy organizations, as well as the other part of doing this work with Civic Power Fund, that this becomes a bit more of a wider resource for all Power Voice democracy organizations. So yeah, I really look forward to seeing what you think about these. Some of them as well, we actually don't have that much information on. We just know that they exist. They might not have a website and logos, that sort of stuff. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about that. And last but not least, training, webinars and guides. So this very straightforwardly is basically all the various events that we've been running over the past year, that we've done over Zoom or have been recorded in some fashion, are stored on here, as well as some of the other resources that we produced. The Democracy Network has produced in partnership with other organizations more often than not, such as the Political System Reform Guide, which I think was largely led by the Sortition Foundation, for example. So, for example, we have the free media training here, the two various videos here. A lot of these link back to YouTube. We have the Collaboration for Democratic Change report, which you can access here as well. And as you can imagine, the more time that we spend on doing this what we think is really important work, this will populate with more free resources for people to use. So guides, training, webinars, and then we'll probably expand this out as we do more of this work. And really importantly, I highly recommend that you do this. You can also tell us how best we can support you. So you could call it a survey of these tools, of these capacity building tools that allow us to have a bit more of an insight into what sort of things that we, from our sort of fairly unique-ish perspective, as this sort of convener in this space and this sort of like, you know, trying to build a framework for everybody else and trying to do the best that we can to support you, how best we can do that. So I feel like we've crossed most of the various aspects. I guess one last thing I'd like to do, harkening back to some of those organizations, actually just talking a bit more about how we develop these resources, not so much this one. This is kind of not relevant to this. It's not relevant to this this part of the discussion. But there's an interesting tale to tell about how these were produced. So the way in which the UK Democracy Map was produced was essentially through making a very long list through Johnny and the work of the team at Corio, and then myself and others over time, through creating this mega list of democracy organizations, and then through subscribing and spending a fair bit of time working through and processing each of those organizations and looking at their website and understanding them in depth and developing the taxonomy and all that sort of stuff. We're subscribed to all of those newsletters, for every single one. I think it's around 80% of 80% of these organizations we have subscribed to. And the way that the way that this piece of work feeds into the wider piece of work that we do within the sector. So, for example, the Democracy Bulletin and check-ins and other pieces, and the information that our team also holds and generates on a monthly basis and tries to share back with the sector through some of these resources and through conversations and events. So through reading those newsletters, through reading those newsletters and having those fingers on the various pulses, the social media, the Slacks, and all these different aspects, we are able to build up these lists of funding, jobs, and the map, and feed into things like the bulletin, which is quite interesting. Anyway, I'm going to jump now back to the presentation. Thanks very much for that. 1 second. So a little bit, the last thing to just let Annie back in. Just the last thing to say on this before we jump into the wider discussion about how we can use these tools together. On May the 15th, we're going to be running a Democracy Community Mapathon. And this is part of the next phase of this work. So we'll be adding in a research library, which we've more or less produced now. We'll be bringing back those democracy events. Sorry, excuse me. We'll be bringing back the democracy events calendar, as well as the UK democracy calendar, which is effectively it's an ad event, if anyone's familiar with that, but it's eventually a subscribable calendar through which you can subscribe to every event that is present in our database or in the sector, preferably. As well as a separate subscribable calendar to subscribe, which already exists, to all Democracy Network events. So all of those meetings, all of the webinars and events like this. And really, I'm really excited about this one. A community resources hub. So it's largely built, but we didn't want to launch it today because we wanted to make sure it was, polished before we launched it and showed it to everybody. But a community resources hub, which is part of the reason why the next session like this is called the Democracy Community Mapathon. And the community resources is very much about, sharing, I guess, the abundance within the sector. A lot of people, so Joe Mitchell, I think, is in the call. Mitchell wrote a report a very long time ago which was called Networking for Democracy, which is very much the Bible of the work that we do at Democracy Sector. Democracy Network. And he talks about how, some of the interviewees in his research there 4 years ago, that report on the health of the democracy sector, whether or not they're making the case for Democracy Network, essentially. He talks a lot about how different organizations kind of understand that they have resources, but no one's really talking about it or sharing those resources. They're not really sharing information as much. They're quite fragmented, or if they are doing that, they're doing that within clusters. And this next piece of work, I hope through that seeding, that generating of information, we're able to do some of that work. We're able to share some of that abundance. So what we're actually talking about here, something more concretely, is say low cost or free event venues for power, voice, and democracy organizations or nonprofits in the UK, is databases, data, contact lists, all sorts of different things. That sort of stuff that we think is like really, really, really useful, and that people will share, hopefully, in that space.